Well, class, it's going to be really interesting to see where everyone's influences were from the previous lesson. Today, we're going to be talking about how the English influenced America. Um, and first, let's just think about influences, and I'll share mine a little bit, right? Obviously, there's this idea that there's a nature versus nurture. Maybe if you're familiar with psychology, that sometimes outside influences that people experience affect who they are, right? For example, I just listened to this awesome podcast about someone who had mercury poisoning and it ended up creating uh, some sort of idea where they were constantly pessimistic or critical or fearful of the future. And it been found that mercury can affect the brain in a way that makes people paranoid in some ways. So certainly, certain chemicals or environmental factors can contribute to who people are. Family members, exposure to different foods. If you had, I'll never forget one time I had a stuffing and I somehow got honey mustard in it and it was awful. I don't quite know how I did it, but for me, a key influence was my sister. Or I don't know if I would quite call her a sister, but in some ways she uh, if you ever heard of an au pair, has anyone ever heard of that? It's kind of like a nanny. It was somewhat my daycare in some ways. And she actually was English. So this goes very well with the lesson. Um, and I think she just instilled in me some sense of creativity or exploration and also some sort of resilience. She actually was hit by a car in 1993. So I was pretty young. I think I was in second or third grade. I don't remember, but she actually ended up losing her leg, and that just created a lot of experiences for me, even though they were hard, to learn about how people can care and how you can care for other people. So it definitely was a huge influence on me. But for the colonists and subsequently America, they were also influenced by certain things, and uh, they're no different, in other words, than we are today. Before I move on with the lesson, I just want to highlight one thing here, and this is this note-taking guide. You could always make a copy. There's a couple questions that you should write down some ideas. Just go over this real quick, how to use this. When we get to influence number 3, that's going to be a really key point in this lesson. But you can fill in any of the blanks. You should be able to fill in the blanks as we go along. And if there's something we get to the end of the lesson, make sure you highlight it. You could always highlight and then make a comment, for whatever you need help here, and you could follow up with me on that. All right, so use that to your advantage, and we will. I'll take a look if need be. Okay. So let's go back to the lesson. So let's talk about influence number 1. That was tradition. At the time of America's founding, and I know that's hard to pin down a date because obviously every date has an influence, but let's talk about really 1609, the 17th century onward. Uh, to say that the colonies were only influenced by England, even though that might be the title of the lesson, would be false. For example, the Dutch heavily established New York City, for example, and one reason New York City is this melting pot today of various cultures is because the Dutch really influenced that. Even beforehand, if you were to go to Holland and Amsterdam, New York City at one point was actually called New Amsterdam. But if you were go to Amsterdam, even in the 17th century, there'd be a confluence of peoples. Uh, even when it comes to religion, even though it was heavily Protestant, there were still multiple different religions in there. In many ways, New York's the same. But we're not going to be talking about necessarily cultural influences per se. The colonies at the time, the 17th century America, were largely made up of various types of groups of people, whether it was slaves from Africa, Native Americans, people coming from England, Germany, um, the Netherlands, like I said, and for all various reasons. So it was fairly diverse. So it would be false to say that it was influenced by England. But when we look at political influences, in other words, how government does and manages power and enacts authority, England was the primary influence. At the time of Jamestown in 1609, England really was the only representative democracy in Europe. If we were to look at Spain, for example, that was largely a monarch, although not as powerful as they had been previously. France, under Louis the 16th, known as Louis the 15th, under the Sun King, for example, um, was an autocratic, totalitarian, authoritarian, dictatorial, even state. So it was very common to have people, have people um, that were under surveillance and they were being spied on. Um, and it was not a democracy at all. It was ruled by a single person, and that was the King of France. The English did take some ideas from Rome, specifically the idea of representation. So Rome at one point had a senate where various people gathered to make decisions on behalf of the nation, or at this point the empire. Rome eventually would drift into a full-on dictator-style government with an emperor, hence Julius Caesar. But the English took some of those ideas of representation, and to the colonists, like I said, England was the most representative democracy at the time. There was a Dutch Republic, but it was very cumbersome, and each province, or think of it as a state in Holland at the time, was very autonomous, which made it very hard to make any decisions at the government level. We'll talk about that a little bit later. You don't necessarily need to know that, but England at the time was by and large the most effective representative democracy. There was still a king in power, and that would shape things as well. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the thing you need to know first off is that when many of the colonies were set up under English rule, they were used to the idea of being represented in the government. And that's the one thing you need to take away from this. The second influence was how we judge people under the law largely came from a principle called common law. And there was this idea that, hey, evidence has to be submitted if you're going to commit, someone's going to be held against their will for committing a crime. The other important part to common law, and this is something that you should know, we'll talk about common law later in the year, but something you definitely should know is that laws and their application under common law have to be considered as a whole, not as a part. So what do I mean by that? In other words, we can't judge someone when they violate the law subjectively. In other words, we can't put that person in jail longer than someone else simply because we don't like them, or the judge didn't like them, or the state, meaning obviously the government, did not like them. So they have to be judged as a part of the whole community, and therefore we also have to judge whether the law is in and of itself a good law. That's a part of the common law tradition, and that's something the colonists took with them as well. The third aspect that was really influential in America, and this is probably the most influential and key part of today's lesson, is this idea of limited government. At the time of many of the colonies' founding, especially New England, Jamestown really wasn't a colony for a couple years after, but especially when we look at New England, they occurred during the time of the English Civil War. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of this a little bit more, but generally speaking, it was a time when Parliament, which is England's representative body, people who go to the capital to make laws, we have what we call that in the United States is Congress, was becoming more powerful, and it effectively decreased the power of the English king. At one point during the English Civil War, actually, the king was beheaded. So I don't think you'd get much lower than that, right? And people were used to the idea that, or they were used to the idea that the government was being limited by the people. Like I said, England was after this time, the most effective representative democracy in all of England. Before the English Civil War, the king still had some power, but by the end of the English Civil War, uh, the king was effectively under the jurisdiction and subjugation of Parliament. And therefore, England became a constitutional monarchy, and by far uh, was really responsible for most of the Western thought today, especially when it surrounds political ideas, um, and that all can be attributed to England. But it created this period where the culture was suspicious of absolute power. They were suspicious of kings. They were suspicious of overzealous governments. They were suspicious of dictators. Um, and the English Civil War was messy, so people were naturally suspicious of government. And that's something that is really key when it comes to influences, because the colonists and subsequently America were used to some sort of independence. So like I said, limited government effectively limits what the government can do, and it's best defined as a government that is restricted either by law or constitution from exercising absolute power. Think of ropes and how they restrain a ship. Some similar ideas that are associated with limited government. These aren't necessarily uh, synonyms. In other words, they're not necessarily replaceable for limited government, but they're similar ideas. They're associated with it. It could include the rule of law, which we talked about in the last unit. Personal property, right? The government doesn't own everything. You own some things. Equality, the idea that people have to be treated the same. Um, Limits of service. So when we say a president can only serve 2 terms, that would be a limit on the government. Can't stay in power forever. Or even boundaries. The government only has so much power in certain areas. Or can only go to certain areas. Think the idea when we talked about state in the last unit of how territory essentially is a necessary component to a state. The boundary of power ends here. That's somewhat associated with the idea of limited government. Some good examples of limited government in practical government life could include the fact that the government can't force you to follow a certain religion. They can't force you to change your religious beliefs, nor can they prohibit you from exercising your religious beliefs. So just because something might be uncomfortable to society from a religious standpoint, or society as a whole might be uncomfortable with it, doesn't mean the government can do anything about it. The government can't take property without following certain procedures, or they can't take someone's life without following certain procedures. So, uh, if the government wants to enter your home, for example, which would technically be a violation of privacy, right? They can't do that unless they go through certain procedures, and it's usually in the process of obtaining a warrant. We'll talk about that later in the fourth quarter. Some non-examples of limited government is the idea that if the president decides to assassinate a member of Congress, that would be absolute power. Or if the government decides to shut down media outlets through force that are critical of the government. So you could think really of the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, for example, or even today, frankly, in Russia or in Venezuela, if certain media outlets are critical of those governments, they're put in jail. If that were to happen in the United States, that would not be an example of limited government. And in many ways, the colonists had this experience. By the time of the early 18th century, so 1700s, and through the period of the English Civil War, many of these rights were written into England's law, and we'll talk about those in the next lesson. But limited government is definitely something you should know, and it's definitely something you should have down your notes. So what examples can you think of that would be some ideas of limited government? Like I said, some key points from this lesson. If you don't know these, please make sure that you reach out or you highlight it on your notes and share it with me. The American colonists brought with them multiple ideas from England to help construct their ideal government. These influences centered around representation, interpretation of the law, and limited government. And limited government is very important. It puts restrictions on the government in the form of law or constitution in order to restrict the power of the government.